Have you ever sat by the phone or stared at it, wondering if today might finally be the day they call? Maybe it's been weeks, maybe months. For some of you, it's been years. And the silence. It doesn't just sit quietly in the background. It fills the room. It follows you into the kitchen, into the grocery store, even into bed at night. You start asking yourself questions you never thought you'd have to ask. What did I do wrong? How did we get here? And the hardest one of all, will I ever hear from them again? If you've ever felt that ache, the kind that doesn't go away with time, you're not alone. More and more parents, especially mothers in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, are facing something that used to be almost unthinkable: estrangement from their own children. And I want you to know something right from the beginning. This isn't about blaming you. This isn't about making you feel worse. This is about understanding and healing. And maybe, just maybe, opening a door that feels like it's been shut for far too long. In today's video, we're going to gently walk through what really causes this kind of distance between parents and children, and more importantly, what you can do, starting today, to begin mending that relationship, even if your child hasn't reached out yet. Because here's the truth that many people don't talk about. Healing doesn't always start with them. Sometimes it begins quietly, within you. And I know that might sound unfair. You might be thinking, why should I be the one to change? They're the one who left. And that feeling is real. It's valid. But what I've seen, time and time again, is that the only place we truly have power is within ourselves. So let's start there. Let's begin with something that might feel a little uncomfortable, but also incredibly freeing if you let it be. The first thing to understand is this: estrangement rarely comes from one single moment. It's not usually just one argument, one misunderstanding, or one mistake. It's something that builds over time, often quietly, often without either side fully realizing it. Think about relationships like a garden. If it's watered, cared for, and tended to, it grows. But if it's neglected, even unintentionally, it can slowly wither. Not overnight, not dramatically, just gradually. And many parents, especially those who spent decades doing their best, making sacrifices, holding families together, they don't always see the small cracks forming along the way. Because you were busy being strong. You were busy surviving. You were busy doing what you believed was right. But sometimes our children experience things differently than we think they do. And this brings us to the first step in mending that distance. And that is gently allowing yourself to become curious about your child's experience without immediately defending your own. Now, I want to be very clear here. This does not mean everything is your fault. It does not mean your child is right about everything. And it certainly does not mean you deserve to be shut out or hurt. But what it does mean is that somewhere in their heart, your child experienced something that felt painful or unsafe or unresolved. And instead of asking, why are they doing this to me? A more helpful question, though harder to ask, is, what might they have felt that I didn't fully see at the time? That shift from defense to curiosity is incredibly powerful, because when we stay in defense, we stay stuck. We replay the same thoughts over and over. We build a case in our minds. We justify, we explain, we protect ourselves. And while that might feel comforting in the moment, it doesn't bring us any closer to healing. Curiosity, on the other hand, opens a door. It doesn't mean you agree. It simply means you're willing to look. And sometimes, when parents begin to do this gently, not harshly, not with self-blame, but with honesty, they start to see small things they didn't notice before. Maybe there were moments when emotions ran high and things were said that lingered longer than expected. Maybe there were times when your child needed something different from you and you didn't know how to give it. Maybe you were carrying your own pain, your own stress, your own past, and it shaped the way you responded. That doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you a human one. And here's something deeply important to understand. Children don't just remember what we did. They remember how they felt around us. If a child, even unknowingly, felt unheard, or dismissed, or overwhelmed by conflict, those feelings don't always disappear with time. Sometimes they grow quieter on the surface, but stronger underneath. And as they become adults, they may not even fully understand why they feel the need to distance themselves. They just know something doesn't feel right. So when you begin to explore your child's experience, not perfectly, not all at once, but little by little, you're doing something incredibly brave. You're stepping out of the role of being right and into the role of being open. And that brings us gently to another truth that many people find difficult to hear, but it carries a lot of hope. The patterns in our relationships often come from patterns we learned long before we became parents. Think back to your own childhood for a moment. How were emotions handled in your home? Were disagreements talked through calmly or avoided altogether? Did you feel safe expressing yourself? Or did you learn to keep things inside? Most of us weren't taught how to handle emotions in a healthy, open way. We weren't taught how to navigate conflict with patience and understanding. We were taught to cope, to manage, to get through. And then, without realizing it, we brought those same patterns into our own families, not because we wanted to hurt anyone, but because it was all we knew. So if your child learned to avoid difficult conversations, or to shut down, or to pull away instead of working through things, there's a good chance they learned that somewhere along the way. And again, this isn't about blame, it's about awareness. Because once you see the pattern, you can begin to change it. And that change doesn't require your child to come back first. It starts with you learning new ways of relating, new ways of responding, new ways of understanding yourself. Now, I know you might be wondering, but what if they never reach out? What if I never get the chance to show any of this? And that's a very real fear. But here's something I want you to hold on to. Change has a way of reaching people, even from a distance. When you begin to shift your energy from hurt and frustration to understanding and growth, you become different. And even if your child doesn't see it right away, that shift matters. Because the next time there is a conversation, or even a small opening, you won't be coming from the same place. You'll be calmer, softer, more grounded. And sometimes, that's what begins to rebuild trust. Not grand gestures, not perfect words, just a different presence. And that leads us into something very practical. Something you can begin doing quietly right now, without needing anything from your child at all. You can begin by looking at the way you respond to your own emotions. Now, I know that might sound simple, but it's actually one of the most powerful things you can do. When a relationship breaks down like this, it stirs up so many feelings. There's sadness, of course, but also anger, confusion, sometimes even guilt. And if we're being honest, there can be moments of resentment too, especially when you feel like you gave so much. And here's what most people do with those feelings. They either push them down or they let them take over. Neither one really helps. Pushing them down doesn't make them disappear. It just buries them deeper, where they quietly shape how you think, how you speak, and how you show up. And letting them take over, that often leads to reactions that create even more distance. So what we're aiming for instead is something gentler, something steadier. We're learning how to sit with those emotions without letting them control us. For example, when you feel that wave of hurt, maybe you see another mother talking about her children, or you pass by a place that reminds you of your family. It's natural for your heart to tighten. Instead of immediately saying, "I can't believe they've done this to me," you might softly say to yourself, "This hurts because I love them." That small shift from blame to acknowledgement changes everything. It keeps your heart open instead of closing it off. And I know keeping your heart open when it's been hurt is not easy. It takes strength, the kind of strength that doesn't always get recognized, but it's there. Another thing that can really help is learning to pause before reacting, especially if there is any contact, even small or occasional. Sometimes a message comes through. Maybe it's short, maybe it feels distant, and your first instinct might be to either pour everything out or to pull back and protect yourself. But in those moments, a pause can be your greatest ally. Take a breath, give yourself time. Ask yourself, what kind of response would bring us closer, even just a little? Not the response that proves your point, not the response that releases all your pain at once, but the one that keeps the door open. It might be as simple as a calm, kind reply, something that says, "I'm here," without pressure, without expectation. Because one of the biggest challenges in these situations is this: when we're hurting, we often want resolution right away. We want the conversation, the apology, the understanding, all at once. But healing, especially in relationships, rarely works that way. It tends to happen in small steps, quiet moments, little openings. And those openings can close just as quickly if there's too much pressure. So learning to be patient, not passive, but patient, is incredibly important. Now let's talk about something that many parents struggle with, but don't always say out loud: the need to be understood. It's such a natural desire. After everything you've done, everything you've given, you want your child to see that, to recognize it, to appreciate it. And when they don't, it can feel deeply unfair. But here's where things get a little delicate. If every attempt at reconnecting is tied to the hope that your child will finally understand your side, it can create a kind of invisible pressure. Even if you don't say it directly, they may feel it. And if they're already carrying their own feelings, whether it's hurt, confusion, or even guilt, they might not be ready to step into that space. So instead of focusing on being understood first, try shifting toward understanding them first. Not forever, not at your own expense, but as a starting point. Because when someone feels truly seen and heard, they become more open. And that openness is what allows conversations to deepen over time. You might not get the response you hope for right away. In fact, you might not get one at all in the beginning. But every time you show up with calmness, with kindness, with a willingness to listen, you are planting seeds. And seeds don't grow overnight. Now there's another layer to this that's very important, and that is learning how to take responsibility without falling into shame. Those two things are very different. Responsibility says, there may have been things I didn't see or didn't do well, and I'm willing to learn. Shame says, I was a terrible parent, and everything is my fault. One leads to growth, the other keeps you stuck, and I want you to stay far away from that second place, because nothing good grows from shame. So if you begin to reflect on your past and notice moments you wish you had handled differently, that's okay. You don't have to judge yourself for it. You can simply acknowledge it and gently say, if I had known then what I know now, I might have done things differently. That's wisdom, not failure. And if the opportunity ever comes to express that to your child, not in a heavy or overwhelming way, but in a simple, heartfelt way, it can be incredibly healing. Something like, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize there are things I didn't understand back then. I'm learning now. No defenses, no explanations, just honesty. That kind of vulnerability, it can be disarming because it shows growth without demanding anything in return. And sometimes, that's what begins to soften the distance. Now, I also want to gently touch on something that often gets overlooked, and that's your own need for support. When you're going through something like this, it can feel very isolating. You might not talk about it with friends because it feels too personal, or maybe you've tried and people don't quite understand. They might say things like, well, they should be grateful, or just move on. And those words, they don't really help. So you end up carrying it quietly. But you don't have to. Finding a space where you can talk openly, whether it's a trusted friend, a support group, or even a counselor, can make a world of difference. Not because they'll fix the situation, but because you won't feel so alone in it. And when you feel supported, it becomes easier to show up with patience and clarity instead of exhaustion. Because let's be honest, this kind of emotional work takes energy. And you deserve care too. You deserve understanding too. And as you begin to take care of yourself in this way, something interesting happens. You start to feel a little more steady, a little less reactive, a little more able to respond instead of react. And that shift, it changes the entire tone of any interaction you have with your child. Even silence begins to feel different, not empty, but patient, not hopeless, but open. And from that place, you can begin to approach something that many people find difficult, but incredibly powerful. When done with care, you can begin to approach the idea of forgiveness. Now, I know that word can bring up a lot of mixed feelings. For some, it feels peaceful. For others, it feels almost impossible. And for many, it feels unfair, like letting go somehow means what happened didn't matter. But that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not saying it was okay. It's not saying they were right. And it's certainly not saying I didn't get hurt. Forgiveness is something much quieter and much more personal. It's the moment you decide that carrying the pain, the replaying of the past, the endless questions is hurting you more than it's helping you. It's choosing to loosen your grip on that pain, not for them, but for yourself. Because when a relationship like this breaks, it can take up so much space in your heart. It can become the lens through which you see everything. And over time, that weight can become exhausting. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it changes your relationship with it. Instead of living inside it, you begin to step outside of it. And here's something many people don't realize. Forgiveness is not a one-time decision. It's a process. Some days it feels easier. Other days, the hurt comes back just as strong. And that's okay. You don't have to rush it. You just have to keep gently returning to the intention. I want peace. And sometimes part of that process includes forgiving yourself for the things you didn't know, for the moments you wish you could redo, for being human in ways you didn't fully understand at the time. Because the truth is, every parent looks back and sees things they would change. Every single one. But you did the best you could with what you knew then. And now, you're learning more. That matters. Now, as you move through this process, understanding, patience, responsibility, and forgiveness, you may begin to notice something subtle but powerful. you start to feel less desperate for things to change immediately. Not because you've given up, but because you've found a little more peace within yourself. And that peace, it's not the end of the story. It's actually what makes reconnection possible. Because when your child does think of you, and they will, even if they don't show it, they won't be reaching back into the same emotional space that existed before. They'll be reaching towards someone who has grown, someone who feels different, and that can feel safer. Now, I want to talk about something very practical, what it looks like to leave the door open without pushing it. This is such a delicate balance. On one hand, you don't want to disappear or pretend you don't care. On the other hand, reaching out too often or too intensely can feel overwhelming to someone who is already pulling away. So what does a gentle open door look like? It looks like simple, low-pressure contact. A message that doesn't demand a response. A note that expresses care without expectation. Something like, "Thinking of you today. I hope you're doing well." No questions that require answers. No emotional weight attached. Just a quiet reminder. I'm here. And if there's no reply, that doesn't mean it didn't matter. Sometimes those messages are read, felt, and held on to quietly. They just don't know how to respond yet. And that's okay. Another important piece here is consistency. Not frequent, not overwhelming, but consistent in your tone. If your messages are sometimes warm and patient, and other times filled with frustration or pain, it can feel confusing. But when your presence becomes steady, calm, and safe, it builds trust, even from a distance. Now, I also want to gently prepare you for something that can happen along this path. There may come a moment when your child does reach out, but not in the way you hoped. It might be brief. It might feel distant. It might even bring up old tensions. And in that moment, everything inside you might want to rush in, to fix it, to explain, to reconnect all at once. But this is where everything you've been working on becomes so important, because how you respond in that moment can either reopen the connection or close it again. So instead of trying to resolve everything, meet them where they are. If they are distant, respond with warmth, not pressure. If they are unsure, respond with patience, not urgency. If they are guarded, respond with calm, not defense. Think of it like rebuilding a bridge, one step at a time. You don't run across it the moment the first plank is laid. You walk carefully. You allow it to strengthen, and that takes time. Now I want to say something that may bring both comfort and a little bit of sadness. Sometimes, despite all the growth, all the effort, all the love, the relationship may not return in the way you imagined. And that is incredibly hard. But even in that reality, the work you've done is not wasted, because you haven't just been trying to fix a relationship. You've been healing yourself. You've been learning how to love without conditions, how to stay open without losing yourself, how to grow, even in the face of uncertainty. And those things, they shape every part of your life. They bring peace into your days. They soften your heart. They allow you to connect more deeply with others and with yourself. And sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, that peace creates new forms of connection. A grandchild reaching out, a letter years later, a quiet reconciliation that begins slowly. Life has a way of surprising us, especially when we've done the inner work. So if you're sitting here today, feeling that ache, that distance, that longing, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not alone. You are not beyond repair, and it is not too late. Even now, there is something you can do. Not to control the outcome, but to change the direction. And that direction begins with understanding, continues with patience, deepens with responsibility, and softens with forgiveness. And through all of that, something beautiful can begin to grow again. If this message spoke to your heart, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes just putting your story into words can be the first step toward healing. And you never know who else might read it and feel less alone. And if you found comfort or clarity here, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel Elderly Faith Journey. We're here to walk through these moments together with honesty, compassion, and hope. No matter where you are in your journey, whether you're waiting, healing, or slowly reconnecting, I'm truly glad you're here. And I want to leave you with this gentle reminder. Love doesn't end when distance begins. Sometimes it simply waits until both hearts are ready to find their way back.